Rebecca Martinez had always been a creature of habit. Every Tuesday evening at precisely 6 o'clock, she would arrive at Eagle's Nest shooting range with her worn leather gun case and a thermos of black coffee. The range was her sanctuary, a place where the chaos of her job as a pediatric nurse melted away with each precise shot. She had been coming here for 3 years, ever since moving to San Diego after her divorce, and the routine had become as essential to her well-being as her morning coffee. The other regulars barely acknowledged her presence anymore. She was just the quiet woman in Lane 7 who never missed her target and never caused trouble. Rebecca preferred it that way. She had learned early in life that drawing attention rarely led to anything good, especially for someone like her who carried secrets that could never be spoken aloud. On this particular Tuesday, the range was busier than usual. A group of military personnel had reserved several lanes for training, their commanding voices echoing through the facility. Rebecca glanced over briefly, noting their precise movements and professional demeanor, before focusing on her own target. She had seen plenty of military personnel at the range before San Diego was crawling with them, but she always kept her distance. As she loaded her Glock 19, Rebecca rolled up her sleeves to get a better grip. The motion was automatic, something she had done thousands of times before without thinking. But today, someone was watching. Commander Jake Thompson, a decorated Navy SEAL with 15 years of service, happened to glance over at the quiet woman in Lane 7 just as she exposed her forearm. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, etched in faded black ink on Rebecca's inner forearm, was a tattoo that Jake recognized instantly. It was a small, intricate design, a compass rose surrounded by specific coordinates and a date. To most people, it would mean nothing, but Jake knew exactly what those coordinates represented, and more importantly, he knew who had been there on that date. The tattoo was identical to one worn by Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Rodriguez, a man Jake had served with in Afghanistan. A man who had been killed in action 3 years ago during a classified mission that officially never happened. A man whose body had never been recovered, whose sacrifice had never been acknowledged, and whose family had been told he died in a training accident. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he set down his weapon. The implications of what he was seeing crashed over him like a tidal wave. Rebecca Martinez wasn't just some random civilian. She was connected to Danny Rodriguez in a way that meant she knew about the mission, about what really happened in those mountains, about the cover-up that had followed. Rebecca continued shooting, oblivious to the storm of recognition happening just 3 lanes away. She had become so accustomed to hiding in plain sight that she never imagined her carefully guarded secret would be exposed by something as simple as rolling up her sleeves. The tattoo had been her way of honoring Danny's memory, of carrying a piece of him with her always. She had never expected it to become a beacon that would draw attention from the very people she had spent 3 years avoiding. Commander Thompson watched her for several more minutes, his mind racing through possibilities. How did she know Danny? What was her connection to the mission? And more importantly, what did she know about the circumstances surrounding his death? The official report was classified, but Jake had always suspected there was more to the story. Seeing this woman, this nurse who seemed so ordinary on the surface, suddenly felt like finding a missing piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. Rebecca finished her session and began packing up her equipment, still unaware that her world was about to change forever. As she holstered her weapon and zipped up her gun case, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find a tall man in military fatigues standing at a respectful distance, his expression serious but not threatening. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jake said, his voice carefully controlled. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo. Those coordinates, they're very specific. I was wondering if you might have a moment to talk." Rebecca's heart stopped. In that instant, she knew her 3 years of careful anonymity were over. The tattoo that had been her private memorial to Danny had just become her greatest vulnerability. She looked into Jake's eyes and saw recognition there, the kind of recognition that came from shared knowledge of classified operations and buried truths. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I think you have me confused with someone else." But Jake shook his head slowly. "Those coordinates are from a mission in Afghanistan. October 15th, 2021. I was there, and I'm betting you know exactly what happened that day." Rebecca's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. For 3 years she had lived with the weight of what she knew, the burden of secrets that could destroy careers and lives. She had promised Danny she would never tell anyone about their connection, about what he had discovered before his death, about the real reason he had been killed. But now, faced with someone who had been there, who might finally be able to give her the answers she had been searching for, she felt her resolve wavering. "I don't know what you're talking about," she repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. Jake studied her face, seeing the fear and the pain she was trying so hard to hide. "My name is Commander Jake Thompson. I served with Master Chief Daniel Rodriguez. He was my friend, and I've spent the last 3 years trying to figure out what really happened to him. That tattoo tells me you might have some answers." Rebecca's composure finally broke. Tears she had been holding back for years began to fall, and she sank down onto the bench behind her. The weight of carrying Danny's secrets alone had been crushing her slowly, and now, faced with someone who might actually understand, she felt the dam finally beginning to burst. "Danny was my husband," she whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of gunfire from the other lanes. "We were married in secret 6 months before he deployed. He made me promise never to tell anyone, said it would put me in danger if the wrong people found out. When they told me he died in a training accident, I knew they were lying. Danny had called me 2 days before he died. He said he had discovered something that went all the way to the top. He was scared, Jake. Danny was never scared, but he was terrified of what he had found. Jake felt the pieces clicking into place. The mission had been compromised from the beginning, but no one had been able to figure out how. If Danny had discovered something, if he had been killed because of what he knew rather than enemy action, it would explain so much. The rushed extraction, the missing body, the immediate classification of all mission details, it all made sense now. "What did he discover?" Jake asked gently. Rebecca looked around the range, suddenly acutely aware of how public this conversation was. "Not here. If you really want to know what happened to your friend, if you really want to understand why he died, then we need to talk somewhere private. But I'm warning you, Commander, once you know the truth, your life will never be the same. The people responsible for Danny's death are still out there, and they have a lot of power. They won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose them." Jake nodded grimly. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel even more dangerous. Still, he owed it to Danny to find out the truth. "Where do you want to meet?" Rebecca thought for a moment, then pulled out a business card from her purse. "This is my address. Come by tomorrow night at 8. Make sure you're not followed. And Jake, don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not yet. Not until we know who we can trust." As Rebecca walked away, Jake stared at the card in his hand. He had come to the range for routine training, but he was leaving with the first real lead he had found in his investigation into Danny's death. The quiet woman in Lane 7 wasn't just a civilian after all. She was the key to uncovering a conspiracy that had cost his friend his life. The next evening, Jake arrived at Rebecca's modest apartment complex exactly at 8 o'clock. He had spent the day running counter-surveillance routes, making sure he wasn't being followed. The paranoia felt justified given what Rebecca had hinted at, and his years of special operations training had taught him to take such precautions seriously. Rebecca's apartment was on the third floor of a nondescript building that looked like hundreds of others in San Diego. When she opened the door, Jake was struck by how different she looked. Gone was the composed woman from the shooting range. In her place was someone who looked haunted, exhausted by years of carrying an unbearable burden. "Come in quickly," she said, glancing down the hallway before closing the door behind him. The apartment was small but neat, with few personal touches. It felt more like a safe house than a home, which Jake supposed it essentially was. Rebecca led him to the kitchen table, where she had laid out a thick folder. "Before we start, I need you to understand something. Danny made me promise to never tell anyone about what he found. For 3 years I've honored that promise. But seeing you yesterday, knowing that someone else cares about finding the truth, I realized that keeping silent isn't protecting anyone anymore. The people who killed Danny are still out there, and they're still in positions of power. Jake sat down across from her, his attention focused entirely on the folder. What did Danny find? Rebecca opened the folder, revealing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be copies of classified communications. Danny was part of a joint task force investigating terrorist financing in Afghanistan. What he discovered was that some of the money being funneled to terrorist organizations was coming from American sources, not just private citizens or corporations. People within the military-industrial complex were actively funding the enemy while publicly supporting the war effort. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He had suspected corruption, but nothing on this scale. Who? Defense contractors, mostly, but also some military officials who were being paid to look the other way. Danny had identified a network of people who were essentially playing both sides of the conflict. They were getting rich off the war while simultaneously ensuring it continued by funding the opposition. Rebecca pulled out a photograph showing Danny with several other soldiers, including Jake himself. This was taken 2 weeks before the mission where Danny died. He had already started collecting evidence, but he hadn't reported it yet. He was trying to figure out how high up the corruption went before he made his move. Jake studied the photograph, remembering that day. It had been during a brief respite between operations, and Danny had seemed distracted, more serious than usual. At the time, Jake had attributed it to the stress of their mission, but now he realized Danny had been carrying the weight of this discovery. The night before he died, Danny called me, Rebecca continued. He said he had finally gathered enough evidence to blow the whole thing wide open. He was planning to report it to the Inspector General as soon as he got back to base. But somehow, the people he was investigating found out. The mission was compromised, and Danny was specifically targeted. "How do you know all this?" Jake asked. Rebecca pulled out a small digital recorder. Danny recorded everything. Every conversation, every piece of evidence he found. He sent me copies of everything through encrypted channels, told me to keep it safe in case something happened to him. He knew he was in danger, but he believed the truth was more important than his personal safety. Jake's mind was reeling. If what Rebecca was saying was true, then Danny's death wasn't just a casualty of war, it was murder. And the people responsible were still out there, still in positions of power, still profiting from the conflict that had cost so many lives. "Why didn't you report this to the authorities?" Jake asked. Rebecca laughed bitterly. To who? Danny had evidence that people within the military hierarchy were involved. How was I supposed to know who I could trust? Besides, I was just a Navy wife who wasn't supposed to exist. Nobody would have believed me, and I would have ended up dead just like Danny. The weight of her situation became clear to Jake. She had been trapped for 3 years, knowing the truth but unable to act on it without putting herself in mortal danger. The isolation and fear must have been overwhelming. "So what changed?" Jake asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rebecca met his eyes, and Jake saw a determination there that hadn't been present before. "Because I realized that staying silent isn't protecting anyone. The people who killed Danny are still out there, still operating, still getting people killed. And because I finally found someone who knew Danny, who cared enough to keep investigating after 3 years, I think maybe it's time to stop being afraid and start fighting back." Jake nodded slowly. The evidence Rebecca had shown him was explosive, but he also understood the dangers they would face if they tried to expose it. The people involved had already killed once to protect their secret, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Rebecca closed the folder and looked at him with an expression of grim resolve. "I want to finish what Danny started. I want to expose these people and make them pay for what they've done. But I can't do it alone. I need someone with your connections, someone who knows how the system works from the inside." Jake considered her proposal. Taking on a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the military and defense establishment would be incredibly dangerous. But he owed it to Danny, and to all the other soldiers who had died while these people profited from their sacrifice. "I'm in," he said, "but we need to be smart about this. These people have resources and connections that we can't match directly. We need to find a way to expose them while protecting ourselves." Rebecca smiled for the first time since he had met her. "I've been thinking about that for 3 years. I have some ideas." Over the next several hours, Rebecca and Jake laid out a plan. They would need to verify the evidence Danny had collected, identify additional sources who might be willing to testify, and find a way to get the information to someone who could act on it without alerting the conspiracy. The task seemed overwhelming, but for the first time in 3 years, Rebecca felt like she had hope. She was no longer alone in carrying the burden of Danny's secrets. She had found an ally, someone who understood the stakes and was willing to risk everything to see justice done. As Jake prepared to leave, Rebecca handed him a copy of Danny's files. "Be careful with these. Make copies and store them in multiple locations. And Jake, thank you. Danny would have been proud to know that someone like you was fighting for the truth." Jake tucked the files inside his jacket and headed for the door. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The paranoia that had started at the shooting range was growing stronger, and he realized that getting involved in this investigation had probably made him a target as well. But he had made his choice. Danny Rodriguez had been his friend, his brother in arms, and he deserved justice. Whatever the cost, Jake was going to make sure the truth came out. The next few weeks passed in a blur of clandestine meetings and careful investigation. Jake used his military connections to quietly verify some of the information in Danny's files, while Rebecca reached out to other military families who might have lost loved ones under suspicious circumstances. What they discovered was even more disturbing than they had initially realized. The corruption wasn't limited to a few bad actors. It was a systematic network that had been operating for years, involving dozens of people across multiple agencies and organizations. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, and the amount of money involved was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But as their investigation deepened, so did the danger. Jake noticed that he was being followed more frequently, and Rebecca reported strange phone calls and people asking questions about her in her neighborhood. It was becoming clear that their activities had not gone unnoticed. One evening, as Jake was leaving his apartment to meet Rebecca, he spotted a black SUV parked across the street. The same vehicle had been following him for the past 3 days, and he decided it was time to confront the situation directly. Instead of getting in his car, Jake walked directly toward the SUV. As he approached, the driver started the engine and began to pull away, but Jake was close enough to see the face of the man behind the wheel. He recognized him immediately. It was Colonel Marcus Webb, one of the officers who had been present during the mission briefing before Danny's final deployment. The implications were terrifying. If Colonel Webb was involved in the surveillance, it meant that the conspiracy reached even higher into the military hierarchy than they had suspected. It also meant that their investigation had definitely been compromised, and that they were both in immediate danger. Jake called Rebecca immediately. "We need to meet now, and we need to assume that everything we've done up to this point has been monitored." They met at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, choosing a public location where they would be relatively safe from direct confrontation. Rebecca looked as shaken as Jake felt. "I've been getting calls," she said without preamble. "People claiming to be from various government agencies, asking questions about Danny, about our marriage. They know Jake. They know everything." Jake nodded grimly. "I just saw Colonel Webb surveilling my apartment. He was at the briefing before Danny's last mission. If he's involved, then we're dealing with people who have access to all kinds of resources." Rebecca's face went pale. "What do we do now?" Jake had been thinking about this possibility for weeks. "We have two choices. We can back down, destroy the evidence, and hope they let us live quietly. Or we can accelerate our timeline and try to get the information out before they can stop us." What does accelerating the timeline mean? It means we take everything we have and give it to a journalist, someone with the resources and credibility to investigate further and publish the story. We won't get to see the investigation through to completion, but at least the truth will be out there. Rebecca considered this for a long moment. If we do that, we'll be putting the journalist in danger too. Yes, Jake agreed, but it might be the only way to ensure that Danny's death wasn't in vain. These people have been operating with impunity for years. If we don't expose them now, they'll continue to profit from conflict while more soldiers die. Rebecca made her decision. Let's do it, but we need to be smart about how we approach the journalist. We need someone who has experience with military investigations, someone who won't be intimidated by pressure from above. Jake had already been thinking about this. I know someone, Sarah Mitchell from the Washington Herald. She's been investigating military corruption for years, and she's never backed down from a story, no matter how powerful the people involved. Over the next few days, Jake and Rebecca worked frantically to organize all of Danny's evidence into a comprehensive package. They created multiple copies, storing them in various locations, and prepared a detailed summary of their findings. The work was exhausting, but they both knew they were running out of time. The surveillance around both of them had increased dramatically. Jake's phone was clearly being monitored, and Rebecca had noticed strange cars parked outside her apartment building. They communicated only through encrypted messages and met only in public places. But they both knew it was only a matter of time before their pursuers made a more direct move. Finally, they were ready. Jake arranged to meet Sarah Mitchell at a coffee shop in Washington, D.C., using a secure communication channel that couldn't be easily traced. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning, and Jake planned to fly to D.C. the night before. But as he was preparing to leave for the airport, Rebecca called with devastating news. "They took everything," she said, her voice shaking. "They broke into my apartment while I was at work. All of Danny's files, all the copies we made, everything is gone." Jake felt his heart sink. Without the evidence, they had no way to prove their allegations. All their work, all their risk had been for nothing. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. "No, but they left a message. They said that if we continued to pursue this, if we contacted any journalists or tried to make any of this public, they would make sure we both disappeared permanently." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of defeat. They had come so close to exposing the truth, but the conspiracy had resources and reach that they simply couldn't match. The people responsible for Danny's death were going to escape justice, and there was nothing they could do about it. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he said. "I'm so sorry." But Rebecca surprised him with her response. "Don't be sorry yet. They took the files from my apartment, but they didn't get everything. I've been storing copies in multiple locations, remember. I still have a complete set of Danny's evidence. And Jake felt a surge of hope. Where? My safety deposit box at the bank. I put a full set of copies there the day after we first met. It's the one place they can't access without a warrant, and getting a warrant would mean explaining why they want the evidence, which would expose their involvement. Jake realized they still had a chance, but they would have to act quickly. We need to get that evidence to Sarah Mitchell immediately, before they figure out where you've hidden it. Agreed, but we can't do this the way we planned. If we try to meet her in person, we'll be intercepted. We need to find another way. Jake thought for a moment. What if we mail it to her? Not directly, but through a series of intermediaries. We could set up a chain of people who forward the package without knowing what's inside. Rebecca nodded. That could work, but we need to be careful about who we trust. And we need to make sure Sarah knows what she's receiving and how to verify its authenticity. They spent the next several hours planning their approach. Jake would retrieve the evidence from Rebecca's safety deposit box, while she prepared a detailed letter explaining the contents and providing verification codes that Sarah could use to confirm the authenticity of the documents. The plan was risky, but it was their only remaining option. If they failed, Danny's killers would continue to operate with impunity, and more soldiers would die to protect their profits. The next morning, Jake accompanied Rebecca to the bank. They had spent the night in a cheap motel, paying cash and using fake names, trying to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. As they approached the bank, Jake noticed several suspicious-looking individuals in the area, but they proceeded with their plan anyway. Rebecca accessed her safety deposit box while Jake kept watch. The evidence was all there. Hundreds of documents, photographs, and digital files that Danny had risked his life to collect. As Rebecca gathered the materials, Jake felt a profound sense of responsibility. This evidence represented Danny's final mission, his last attempt to serve his country by exposing the corruption that was destroying it from within. They left the bank separately, with Rebecca carrying the evidence in a nondescript bag. Jake followed at a distance, watching for any sign that they were being followed. As they reached Rebecca's car, he saw the black SUV again, parked across the street with Colonel Webb behind the wheel. "Go," Jake told Rebecca. "Drive to the post office and mail the package. I'll create a distraction." Rebecca hesitated. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done days ago. I'm going to confront Colonel Webb directly." Before Rebecca could protest, Jake walked straight toward the SUV. As he approached, he saw Webb reaching for something inside his jacket, probably a weapon. But Jake was faster, and he had the advantage of surprise. He yanked open the driver's door and grabbed Webb by the collar, pulling him out of the vehicle. "You son of a bitch," Jake said, his voice filled with rage. You killed Danny Rodriguez, and you've been trying to cover it up ever since." Webb struggled to break free, but Jake's grip was iron. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Thompson. This is bigger than you can imagine." "Then enlighten me," Jake said. "Tell me exactly how big this conspiracy is. Tell me how many people have died to protect your profits." Webb's expression shifted from fear to something like pity. "You really don't understand, do you? This isn't about money. It's about national security. The operations you're trying to expose are sanctioned at the highest levels of government. Rodriguez was killed because he was going to compromise vital intelligence assets." Jake felt a chill of doubt. What if Webb was telling the truth? What if Danny had stumbled onto something that was legitimately classified for national security reasons? But then he remembered Rebecca's words about the defense contractors, about the systematic corruption that had been documented in Danny's files. Whatever Webb was claiming, it didn't change the fact that people were profiting from war while soldiers died. "Even if that's true," Jake said, "it doesn't justify murder. Danny was a patriot. He deserved to know the truth about what he was fighting for." Webb's response was cut short by the sound of sirens in the distance. Someone had called the police, and Jake realized he had only moments before the situation became even more complicated. He released Webb and stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. "The truth about Danny Rodriguez is going to come out, no matter what you do to stop it." As Jake walked away, he hoped that Rebecca had been successful in mailing the evidence to Sarah Mitchell. The confrontation with Webb had been satisfying, but it had also probably accelerated the timeline for their enemy's response. They would need to disappear quickly if they wanted to survive long enough to see the story published. Rebecca was waiting for him at a predetermined rendezvous point several blocks away. "Did you send it?" he asked. She nodded. "It's on its way to Sarah Mitchell through a chain of 3 intermediaries. She should receive it within a week." Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had done everything they could to get the truth out, but now they had to wait and see if their efforts would be enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them. "What now?" Rebecca asked. Jake looked at her, seeing the exhaustion and fear in her eyes. For 3 years she had carried the burden of Danny's secrets alone. Now, she had risked everything to ensure that the truth would finally be revealed. "Now we disappear," he said. "We find somewhere safe to lay low until the story breaks, and we hope that Sarah Mitchell is as brave and determined as her reputation suggests." As they drove away from San Diego, Jake couldn't help but think about Danny Rodriguez. His friend had died believing that he was serving his country, never knowing that he was being manipulated by the very people he had sworn to protect. But maybe, if their plan worked, Danny's death would finally serve a purpose. Maybe the truth would finally set them all free. The story that Sarah Mitchell published 3 weeks later sent shockwaves through the military establishment and the defense industry. Using the evidence that Danny had collected and the additional documentation that Jake and Rebecca had provided, she was able to expose a corruption network that had been operating for over a decade. The investigation that followed led to dozens of arrests and the exposure of systematic fraud involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Defense contractors lost their contracts, military officers were court-martialed, and the families of soldiers who had died in compromised missions finally learned the truth about their loved ones' sacrifices. But the cost of exposing the truth was higher than Jake and Rebecca had anticipated. Both were forced to enter witness protection programs, giving up their identities and their lives in San Diego. The people they had exposed had long memories and extensive resources, and the threat against them was considered credible and ongoing. Rebecca never practiced as a nurse again. Jake was forced to leave the military he had served faithfully for 15 years. They both paid a heavy price for their decision to seek justice for Danny Rodriguez. But they had no regrets. Danny's death had finally been avenged, and the corruption that had killed him had been exposed. The truth, as Danny had believed, had been more important than their personal safety. Years later, when the initial furor had died down and most of the principals had been prosecuted, Jake and Rebecca would sometimes meet at a small diner in a town whose name they couldn't reveal. They would talk about Danny, about the friends they had lost, and about the price of truth in a world where power and money often mattered more than honor and sacrifice. They had started as strangers who happened to meet at a shooting range. They had become allies in a fight for justice, and in the end, they had become the guardians of a truth that had cost everything to reveal but had been worth every sacrifice to expose. The tattoo on Rebecca's arm had faded over the years, but the memory of what it represented remained as clear as ever. Danny Rodriguez had died believing in something greater than himself, and his sacrifice had not been in vain. The truth he had died trying to expose had finally seen the light of day, and the people responsible for his death had been brought to justice. It was a victory, but like all victories in the war against corruption and abuse of power, it had come at a tremendous cost. Jake and Rebecca had lost their old lives, but they had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that they had honored their friend's memory and upheld the principles he had died defending.